The argument that I want to make this afternoon is that Canada and ASEAN have much in common and really should be natural allies, particularly in what I see as an increasingly chaotic and uncertain world. Now, I just want to make sure that I have the requisite picture of Justin Trudeau before you. This is to show you that there's continuity in our relationship, the relationship between ASEAN and Singapore and Canada, and I think by extension ASEAN. I want to thank Jason. Is Jason in the room? Jason Salem, thank you very much. He's the one that dug this out and contributed. So thanks, Jason. I think it's important that we understand that Canada actually does value its relationship with the region. So, Canada. What I'm going to do is to give you a little bit of a history here of Canada, and then maybe of ASEAN as well, though I'm a bit wary about that because you all have much more knowledge of ASEAN than I do. And I know that Singaporeans tend to consider to be much more focused on the present and the future, but I'm interested in looking at the past a little bit to try and tell us a little bit about the present and the future. So what I want to do is to note that Canada, over the last 150 years, has grown to its 10 provinces, but was extremely vulnerable in the first few years. You can see that it grew gradually, a bit like ASEAN, but there are differences, but it grew gradually over the years. And since the country was pieced together, and that string of provinces across the northern section of the United States. And I think the important thing to take from this is that Canada is a very diverse country. Now, I've lived in British Columbia, in Alberta, Nova Scotia, and I now live in Ontario. And those are diverse provinces. Very different. And I haven't even lived in Ontario and Newfoundland, which are probably the most distinct provinces. So the point I want to get across is that this is a really kind of diverse, but the diversity brings with it a good deal of dynamism. So how did Canada stay together? Well, I think a good deal of political will was exercised by the early leaders, but also, importantly, I think, by a series of kind of communication projects. The Transcontinental Railway, the Canadian Pacific Railway, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which I think perhaps doesn't get the credit it deserves for holding the country together, the Trans-Canada Airlines across the north as well as across the southern parts of Canada, the Trans-Canada Highway, and we've just completed, or no, we haven't quite completed, but they hope to complete, but they want to complete by the end of the year, a thing called the Great Trail, which allows you to hike and canoe across various parts, all of Canada. So it's, in current parlance, this is the connectivity which brought Canada together. Now, out of this comes, I think, three significant features from Canadian history. First of all, Canada, for a long time, and some people would say even to the present, is essentially a transatlantic oriented country. Britain and France provided the kind of founding peoples. In Quebec and kind of Nova Scotia in particular, the Scots in Nova Scotia, in Ontario, kind of Irish, English. And also there was waves of European immigration. I have to point out that, of course, First Nations people have been there a long time, and we should not forget that. We should also not forget that the Transcontinental Railway that I talked about before was actually built, particularly in the Rockies, by Chinese immigrants. A lot of Chinese immigrants came in through the 19th century. There were also Japanese immigrants up until the Second World War. They actually got interned and put in camps in Alberta, but they too were important. But the vast majority of immigrants have been Europeans. As I talk about the Ukrainians, the Dutch, the Italians, the Greeks, the Hungarians, the Portuguese, the Czechs. Whenever there was an economic or political crisis in Europe, in a particular country, then we would see waves of immigrants. And again, my point is that this has created huge dynamism in Canadian society. But also, yes, diversity, which needs to ensure that we have a country that is inclusive. The second features, I think, the overwhelming presence of the United States. A preoccupation with maintaining good relations with the United States, and at the same time a level of autonomy. We don't want to get overwhelmed, but I'm sure many of you will know, or if you don't know, you will appreciate this if I tell you that generally the percentage of trade with the US has fluctuated over the years, but it's essentially between 75 and 90% of our trade is with the United States. So you can see how overwhelmed we are by the American presence. Also culturally, we have easy access to American media, good and bad. Actually, one of the reasons I think why the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, was put in place in the 1930s was to counter all those radio stations that were coming across the border from Buffalo, Detroit, New York, Seattle. The third element that I want to emphasize is that we have this federal system. In order to encompass the large and diverse society and polity, we've developed this loose federal system. So the provinces actually have quite a lot of power in our federal system, perhaps amongst the most diverse and loose federal system in the world. You might call it the Canadian way, because what it does is to slow down, some people say, the decision-making process. But it does mean that the decisions tend to be bought into by all the different stakeholders. It's perhaps the reason why we are more sympathetic to the ASEAN way than perhaps other countries. Let me just provide you an example. So this is a cartoon, political cartoon by a guy called Terry Mosher, who goes by the name of Aislinn in the Montreal Gazette. And this is a kind of famous cartoon, which you can see. But if you put ASEAN way in there, would anybody blink? I don't think so. I think it's kind of would capture the essence of the ASEAN way. So my point is that this is, this is the Canadian way. This is the, so we have some sympathy for your notions of the ASEAN way. I know not necessarily that Singaporeans are not terribly sympathetic to the ASEAN way, but maybe I'll convince you by the end that you should be a lot more sympathetic. Maybe not. Okay, so the other interesting thing, of course, is Canadians have agonized over their identity. Like, what is the Canadian identity? As American as apple pie, as Canadian as what? Eh? Mounties. Right, okay, so I've put together a list of suggestions. So what happened was that in the 1970s, a guy called Peter Zarski, who was this beloved broadcast journalist who was on the CBC, you can tell I'm a fan of the CBC, who was on the CBC, he put out this competition. He said, okay, we've got to get, our Canadian identity, we have to get some idea about who we are. How should we portray ourselves? So they had lots of suggestions, and I put some of the suggestions down here. And I have to tell you, this is a very Canadian list. I made sure that every part of Canada was represented in this list, otherwise I would get criticized. Okay, so it's a Canadian list. lots of ideas. Often we see ourselves as not being American, which is very important. I was going to show you on my bag here, I've actually got a maple leaf tag just to show that I'm not American. So, and that's not true, but anyway, so the question then is, who won? What was the winner? So the winner was as Canadian as possible under the circumstances. Okay? So how does that sound as a motto for ASEAN? As ASEAN as possible under the circumstances. So my point again is that, you know, Canadians and members of ASEAN have lots in common. Like, you know, ASEAN kind of has agonized over this question of trying to develop an ASEAN identity. Well, we've done this. We've gone before you. We're happy to give you this phrase, if you want it. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that there are lots of parallels between Canada and ASEAN, which actually should draw us as a country and a region together. So ASEAN. So I know I'm treading on kind of difficult terrain here because you will know more than I do. But let me just try and persuade you of the value of ASEAN. Now, rather like Canada, ASEAN in 1967 was pretty vulnerable. The distinguished Singapore diplomat, Tommy Koh, notes a couple of years ago, he said, pundits at the time thought the new regional organization would probably not survive its infancy. Their skepticism was understandable, he says. And of course, in the first few years, everybody said, well, will ASEAN survive? And in fact, if you go through every 10 years, there's a kind of retrospect, you know, how is ASEAN doing 10, 20, 30, 40 years into its existence? And always it's crisis. It always seems to be a crisis, but they get through. So in 1967, Bangkok, the Bangkok Declaration, and everybody, as Tommy Koh says, everybody says, it won't survive. But in fact it did. Perhaps good luck. We have US spending on the Vietnam War, which tends to lift all economic boats in the region and does a great job. In 1977, the end of the Vietnam War, the external threat goes. Everybody says that was the glue that kept ASEAN together. Won't survive. But it did. Actually, commodity prices were quite high. Oil prices were quite high. Money coming into the region again. 1987, I actually wrote a piece in 1988 about, you know, ASEAN at 20. Would it survive? There was the aftermath of the 1985-86 recession, and people said, no, maybe it won't survive. But it did, because in 87, 88, 89, there was this massive influx, wave of foreign direct investment out of Japan because of the Plaza Accord, followed by investment from South Korea, Taiwan, Europe, as everybody tried to catch up with Japan. 1997, of course, ASEAN was bound to collapse. You had the Asian financial crisis and the expansion of the membership. But ASEAN was able to export its way out of that crisis. The dot-com bubble meant that America was absolutely humming. The American economy was humming. And when the dot-com bubble burst, China was on the rise, joins the WTO, and the economy takes off, and in a sense takes ASEAN economies with it. 2007, the crisis was the two-speed ASEAN, and then of course the global financial crisis. China brings in a stimulus package. We have aid to the CLMV countries, and ASEAN survives. 2017, we have the threat from China. Will ASEAN survive? So you can, my answer is yes. It's done it in the past. It's done pretty well in the past. I know there are skeptics out there. I think it'll survive. In fact, Tommy Koh has, continuing that article, he said, ASEAN has a track record of proving its skeptics wrong. And I would agree with him 100%. So in that respect, and again, I'm interested in your comments, but I'm kind of skeptical of the skeptics. I want to know, how do you analyze ASEAN? In fact, how do you analyze any regional organization? How can I go to the Canadian government and say, yeah, ASEAN is actually going to do pretty well. It's done pretty well. Well, in order to try and evaluate ASEAN, I came up with this schema, which incidentally I found in a book that was developed by two preeminent Canadian political scientists, Herman Backfuss and Grace Skarkstead, who were writing about Canadian federalism. And they had a schema in which they looked at performance and legitimacy. I divide performance into effectiveness, efficiency, and legitimacy. And so I've used these dimensions of a regional organization, as it were, to examine ASEAN. So effectiveness is obviously the ability to produce the desired results. Efficiency is the extent to which you get as much as possible with the least expense, and legitimacy is in terms of the acceptance of a political institution's right to make sure that its members follow its policies, and also whether external political institutions see an organization as performing an appropriate role. So if we look at effectiveness, the skeptics, of course, argue the ASEAN way, process over progress, all carrot no stick, lack of institutionalization, weak secretariat. You know this list of complaints that the ASEAN, that the skeptics want to trot out at the drop of a hat. Myself, as an optimist, I would say what ASEAN has provided, it's been very effective in providing regional stability. It's been very effective in providing a growing economy. And I might add, it's also created a kind of framework, an architecture for dialogue, discussion, debate, which have allowed for the resolution, or at least the discussion without resort to violence, of a number of issues. I just want to underscore this point by noting that Stephen Pinker and Andrew Mack, Andy Mack used to be at ANU, he's then moved to UBC and Simon Fraser, and Stephen Pinker, they actually, I'm sure what they wanted to do was to show in this figure, this graph, that they argue why the world is not falling apart. So since the end of the Cold War, violence has gone down quite remarkably. In fact, major international wars between states is practically non-existent. But the part of the graph that I really am interested in is the bit from 1967 to about 1992, the first 25 years of ASEAN. So you can see violence around the world was on the up. ASEAN bucked the trend, and it brought peace, that long peace of Kimo Tivimaki, the long peace of ASEAN. And my argument is that there's a virtuous circle here, where you get the peace that ASEAN brought with its diplomacy, produced an inflow of capital, that inflow of capital produced peace, and so on, and so on, and so on. So a virtuous circle, which started back in the first 25 years of ASEAN and has continued on since then. So, effective. Yes, of course, ASEAN has been effective. And I can go to the Canadian government and say, yeah, this is a good organization to get involved with. Has a tradition of effectiveness. Efficiency. One of the things that I think the skeptics tend to miss out on. They say, well, nothing's achieved, so no, low efficiency. My argument is actually it's very efficient. when you look at how much the ASEAN members put into ASEAN, it's very little. What, 2 million in dues, as it were, to pay for the, each, to pay for the secretariat, about 1 million, perhaps 1.5 million for attendance at meetings. Dr. Tumsak is the expert on all this, but I think essentially not a huge amount, 3.5 million a year. And the leverage is phenomenal. I mean, yeah, for each country. And the leverage is phenomenal. They get programs, money towards programs and projects from a wide variety of countries, including the EU, Japan, Australia, Canada. Canada supplies money to, for security assistance, for development support. It's not always the case that you see this money coming from Canada with a big red maple leaf on it, because often it's funneled through other organizations like the OECD or the Asian Development Bank or the Red Cross, but nonetheless it is spent. So when you look at what Britain and the Europeans are doing now, they're haggling over what? Whether Britain should pay $60 billion or $120 billion, and ASEAN countries are paying 2 million, 3 million, 3.5 million. I think that each of the ASEAN members actually gets an awful lot out of ASEAN. Pretty efficient, wouldn't you say? Legitimacy. Legitimacy is obviously in the eye of the beholder. There's lots of beholders here. The most important beholders, I think, are the member governments. Legitimacy I consider in terms of process, what I call process legitimacy. Mr. Trump is president because he didn't win the most votes, but he won the Electoral College. So everybody says, okay, he's the president. So that's the process, and that gives him legitimacy. And I think for member governments in ASEAN, the ASEAN way gives legitimacy. I've also talked about performance legitimacy. That's the kind of end product, whether you can produce stability, prosperity. And I think international organizations, while they may have some concern about ASEAN, dealing with ASEAN, generally they can be quite positive. If you look at ASEM, if you look at the East Asian Summit, Obama had the big US-ASEAN Summit, was it last year, year before? Rex Tillerson earlier this year hosted an ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Washington. Paul Keating, the former Prime Minister of Australia, mused not so long ago that maybe Australia should be an observer at ASEAN. I don't know. So all those Australian skeptics, my colleagues, like, well, I won't name them, they, Australia perhaps is more positive about ASEAN than some of its academics. Now, obviously, there are civil society organizations, NGOs, that can be negative about ASEAN. Some business groups don't feel that it produces as much as they would like. Groups that are trying to push for democracy, human rights can be critical, and I see that and I understand that. But on the other hand, at the level of the general public, there aren't many surveys that I know of, but the surveys that I have seen suggest that people are quite positive. So you've got a book in the bookstore here which talks about young people know ASEAN. 83% feel that this is students across universities in the ASEAN countries, feel they're citizens of ASEAN. 89% agree that ASEAN membership is beneficial for their country. So this is the next generation. These are the guys that are going to come up and take over from all the older skeptics. So move over. These are the guys that feel very positive about ASEAN. So my point here is that Canada should feel positive about ASEAN. I hope that ASEAN feels positive about Canada. I think we make very similar contributions to promoting stable and a secure and peaceful planet. I use the word planet here kind of advisedly with quotation marks. Chrystia Freeland, who is our Minister of Foreign Affairs, who many of you will know as a former, maybe not as a former North American managing editor for the Financial Times. She has an excellent book out on the oligarchs in Russia. She's a very smart woman. And she's also actually my MP, so I'm very happy to have her as my MP. She made a speech in Parliament earlier this month, I think the 6th of June, which was well received, I think, nationally and internationally. There are some concerns, I'll come to those in a minute. But I noticed that she talked about the planet. And I think this is coming out of the environmentalists who are worried about the planet. And now we're getting, so we moved from international to global. Everything was international, then suddenly everything was global political economy. So now we're going to get planet, I think, is being introduced. So I just wanted to warn you. But Canada and ASEAN have similar contributions to make as kind of entrepreneurial leaders. Canada, of course, introduced the world, the globe, the planet, to peacekeeping because of the Suez Canal crisis in 1956. Lester Pearson, for which he won the Nobel Prize, put forward the idea of peacekeeping to keep the various warring factions apart. Of course, Canada was very much involved in the landmines ban. The treaty is often known as the Ottawa Treaty, came into effect 1999. Paul Martin was very much involved in putting forward the idea of what he then called an L20, a Leaders 20. This is around the end of the 1990s through until the early part of the 2000s. And he kept putting this idea and we said, well, we don't quite like it. And then along came the global financial crisis and Mr. Bush said, we need a meeting to solve this. Oh, Paul Martin's got a really good idea. So they kind of piggybacked on the idea of Paul Martin's L20, G20, and that's where the origins of the G20 come from. So a Canadian idea, Canada as kind of ideas, leading ideas. I think ASEAN has done very much the same thing with the ARF, ASEAN +3, ASEM, the East Asian Summit, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. All these are kind of ideas that ASEAN has promoted and put forward and have been picked up by other people. Now, my point is that in a hostile world, in a sense, Canada and ASEAN we need each other. We have the Trump administration abdicating its long-held, or America's long-held position as a guarantor of an open, stable international system, which incidentally, of course, America helped to create. So who knows where we're going with Trump. An increasing institutionalization of international relations, a kind of flattening out of, we used to have America at the top, and now we've got a flattening out in the sense of the hierarchy, the global hierarchy, and increased regional institution, which have all brought uncertainty to the world. Now, and we also have rise of nationalism, mercantilism, neo-mercantilism, anti-globalization groups, many of which perhaps have very valid reasons, but this again raises questions about the old kind of order that we tended to take for granted perhaps in the 1990s and the 2000s. And of course we have terrorism, terrorist activities around the world. So we have a hostile world. And I think within this hostile world, both ASEAN and Canada are committed to very much the same things. Canada, both are committed to multilateralism. Canada is a serial joiner, and name any organization, we'll join it. G20, G7, G20, OAS, APEC, WTO, Commonwealth, La Francophonie, Arctic Council, NATO, I could go on. You get the message. We love multinational organizations. And I think ASEAN is clearly committed to multinational organizations, particularly at the regional level. And I think, we're also committed to, as a consequence, to peaceful resolution of disputes and the integrity of borders. Actually, Chrystia Freeland, in that speech that I mentioned to Parliament, was emphasized very strongly the integrity of borders. Canada has been quite upset about the way in which Russia has marched into the Ukraine. Chrystia Freeland speaks Russian and Ukrainian, so that's one of the reasons why she has an interest. But I think Canadians generally see the integrity of borders as being sacrosanct, or should be. I think, like any kind of medium-sized power, and there are many within ASEAN, Canada tends not to want to have military power used to overthrow the international order, which is why, of course, we tend to like rule-based international order. Canada is very keen on the rule of law, and ASEAN, I think, is similarly committed, and in the Bangkok Declaration, of course, there's talk about the rule of law, but I think I would kind of see ASEAN as being committed to what I would call a rules-based regional and international order, perhaps less tied into kind of legal framework, perhaps a more normative framework, but certainly committed to rules as a way, as I say, of constraining major powers. So, what should Canada do? Well, I think there's a checklist of things. I think at the heart of it is that we really need a comprehensive Asia strategy. How does China, actually there's talk at the moment in Canada of a kind of China strategy, but I think that's missing the point. For me, it has to be an Asia strategy so that we can see where China, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN all fit in. And I think part of the problem here is that Ottawa in particular tends to have that European focus. And we have to drag it and say, okay, you've got to think about Asia, and you've got to think about Asia in a comprehensive way. And that would include, I think, pushing a little bit more forcefully forward on an FTA with China. There is a kind of first steps towards an FTA with exploratory steps with ASEAN. And I think both of those would be important, particularly if RCEP actually comes to fruition. I know that's, there's kind of, it's in the balance, but I think Canada has to think about that, because these are the dynamic economies of the world. This is where Canada is going to get the growth in trade. I think the Canadian strategy should emphasize this idea of multilateralism. Again, Chrystia Freeland's speech was pretty strong in terms of putting forward the idea of multilateralism. I think we really need to try and perhaps a bit harder to join the East Asian Summit. I know some members are not keen, but I think we have to try. I think we have to promote Canada-ASEAN people-to-people relations. There are around 12,000 ASEAN students enrolled in Canadian universities, not all of them at UBC, some of them across the different universities. That's important. There are major groups, Vietnamese groups who have done really well. The boat people they've got children, and they're children's children, and they're doing fantastically well and making huge contributions to Canada. Filipino community is crucial to parts of the Canadian healthcare, home care sectors. So that there is this link of business. The business link is really important. Sometimes I talk to people in ASEAN and they don't realize that Bombardier is a Canadian company. When you next step on the MRT here, those are Bombardier cars. That's Canada. Sometimes I think we're here and you don't recognize us. The same thing with the BlackBerry. The BlackBerry in Indonesia is very popular in Indonesia still, with Obama and Indonesians. And the BlackBerry is a Canadian company. REM is a Canadian company. So I think people-to-people relations is important. I would resurrect, there was a thing called the Canada ASEAN Centre back in the 1980s. And I was the academic director of that. And one of the things we did was to provide $5,000 to 20 students each year to go off to ASEAN and do research, do whatever they wanted. $5,000, you had to show that you were there, and you could go wherever you wanted, and was very free and easy, but it was very, very effective. And we got probably 6 or 7 years of that. So 150 students got to know more about ASEAN and developed links. And I think that a Canada ASEAN Centre, maybe in Jakarta, tied in with the Canadian ambassador to ASEAN, would be a real plus in terms of bringing students, business people, media, and cultural representatives. What might ASEAN do? I think that ASEAN has to recognize that Canada has a lengthy history of successfully dealing with major powers. During the Cold War, we had the United States to the south, and we had across the Arctic Circle, Russia, Soviet Union then. We've been able to deal with it. One wonders whether ASEAN in the future will have to deal with China on the one hand and India on the other hand. But Canada has some experience with these kinds of things, particularly dealing with the United States. And I think that's something that ASEAN might want to pick up on and to take advantage of. I think Canada can be a major ally in maintaining and developing the rules-based international order in environment, for example. I think Singapore is particularly vulnerable, as is Canada, because of the Arctic and extensive coastline, security issues, transportation infrastructure, and so on and so forth. I would like to see ASEAN admitting Canada to the East Asian Summit. I would urge ASEAN to do so, though it may not only be ASEAN that's standing in our way. I would like to see ASEAN promoting this people-to-people relationship. I think that's been the constant. It's not just that government, the people-to-people has been relatively constant. It's been at the government level that we've had this inconsistency up and down. And I think that has to be promoted. And finally, conclusion. So my conclusion is that we've got a lot in common. In a rapidly changing, chaotic world, we're natural allies. And what I hope is that in 10 years' time, at the 50th anniversary of the ASEAN-Canada Dialogue Partnership, I hope that the partnership has further matured and we'll be able to take full advantage of the things that we hold in common and our common interests. Thank you very much.